Welcome to Oncology Unscripted. My name is Matt Spraker, a radiation oncologist in Denver, Colorado.
My name is Katie Coleman. I am a kidney cancer patient and patient advocate in Austin, Texas.
And my name is Julie Johnson, and I am a sarcoma patient and patient advocate in St. Louis, Missouri.
We're teaming up to meet in the middle for a candid and educational podcast about cancer that is intended for patients, doctors, and their teams. This show and our opinions are meant for general informational purposes and are not medical advice. We encourage you to reach out to your doctors to discuss your individual case. Thanks for listening. Now let's get on with the show. So my understanding of the background of this is that we decided we were going to talk about radiation as a topic, which I'm obviously excited about and biased as a radiation oncologist. But I was hoping, the original goal of this show is to try to bring patients into the real discussions that we have about radiation, about cancer care and oncology. And so I hope that this starts like kind of a theme that we can do where we can maybe talk in more detail about some of the ways that people are treated. And so I don't want to just do radiation, but hopefully we can do like chemo in the future, immunotherapy or things like that too, different types of surgery, that kind of stuff. So I thought we should do 3 episodes for radiation because Katie and Julie, actually you both did, right? You asked questions to patients. You basically said, well, why don't you explain what you did to generate this list of questions that we got?
Yeah. So as we were talking about this, I know for me, one thing that stood out is I really don't know a whole lot about radiation. And so I had questions that I knew I had, but I figured if I had questions, so did probably several other patients, especially because radiation isn't super common in kidney cancer. I think it's starting to be picked up a little bit more now. But so I asked the question in a couple of support groups, as well as just on my social media to ask people if they had any questions about radiation. And then we queued up some of those questions to answer here on the podcast to see if we can touch on any of those subjects. And then I think, Julie, you might have done something similar as well.
Yeah, I've had radiation. So 4 years ago, I received radiation as part of my treatment strategy. But, similar. It's been 4 years. I know a lot has changed since then. And, I know different cancers have, different ways of using radiation. So I just reached out to patients in various support groups that I'm in and collected their questions about radiation.
It seems like you both got a lot of questions. Like, I don't know if it's more or less than the usual engagement you get when you try to engage your audiences. Do you feel like to me, there's like a huge number of questions and so many of them are like really good questions that are pretty spot on for like the things that patients should be asking in my opinion.
I feel like I got a lot of questions and a pretty decent response, but I also think just in general in the groups and avenues that I post these things, it's I think patients are kind of just talking about these things in general. So I don't know if I would say that it's super unique to radiation, but I will say that usually patients are answering questions for each other on those platforms. And I didn't see very much of that when it came to radiation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
No, I think it's good. And I was actually really, this reminded me a lot. I did a project with a society a couple of years ago that was like an Ask Me Anything doctor YouTube based thing that was focused more on sarcoma, but the goal was to educate people about radiation. And I used a Google form just to generally ask if people had questions. And I think, Julie, you might've shared that in one of your groups at the time.
Yeah.
And this reminded me of that because we got a lot of really good questions. I would actually say that these ones were probably even more on point in terms of the important topics that we've been talking about as a field. And so looking at the questions, I sort of thought we could try to do 3 episodes. And the first one that we'll do now is kind of like a 101. And the reason that's important is I was looking around during this planning time to see the materials online. And I think a lot of people don't know these things because the radiation resources that are online are, they seem to give a lot of information, but it's a really highly technical field that is pretty mysterious to people, in my opinion, compared to medical oncology are giving chemo and then surgery. And so it's like, I think the people who write these materials, they try to, get all the technical stuff in there that is important, but it kind of to me as a reader, it just makes it really hard to kind of like get the concepts of like, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my cancer? And like, what does it mean for my treatment? I don't know if you had a chance to like read any materials, or Julie, if you like had thoughts about like when you were heading into meeting the radiation team for the first time, like, did you feel like the materials were supportive, or like, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what's out there now.
Yeah. So when I think back to my case and my experience and what it was like for me before my radiation consult, and I guess maybe I should say that you were my radiation oncologist.
Oh yeah. Wait, let's just say that really quick. So I was your radiation oncologist. So you were treated with my team in our center, and you were treated with protons. Right. So
yes.
we're going to, I think with your permission, we'll talk about this during the proton episode, because I think that your case is actually a great example of where, you and I both feel like there was benefit there, but there's a lot to talk about with proton therapy. And so we'll use your case as kind of like a model to talk about it. If you're okay with that.
Yes, absolutely. But when I think about what that space of, when I was going in to meet with you for the first time, I knew nothing about radiation. I had no idea what to expect. The only thing I knew was that I was going to get some type of like skin burn, and that it was going to be painful. And I remember being, at the time, again, radiation was the first treatment that I had following my cancer diagnosis. And at the time, I remember being less concerned, just me personally, less concerned about how it worked and more concerned with like, how is this going to impact my life? I had a 1-year-old baby at home at the time, and I wasn't sure, I remember thinking a lot about like, what precautions do I have to take, if any, around my kids? How is this going to impact my ability to work and to function at home? So just from me as a patient, before I went into that consult, I remember just having this sense of like, not necessarily being all that. I didn't feel like I needed to really understand how it worked. I needed to understand how it impacted my life. I think a lot of that changed a little bit as I moved through my cancer experience. But that was definitely what it felt like going into the consult.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's actually a good point to me, what the challenge is with a lot of the materials that are out there for people is that they do try to teach how it works. And then they, separate from that, teach what to expect, which is in a way like how it affects your life, right? Talking about the sunburn, things like that.
Yeah.
And then there's also lots of talk about devices, because fundamentally radiation oncology is an industry of medical devices. And so there's, just like anything else in the US medical system, there's advertisements and things like that. But instead of like in the medical oncology world, they're like drug advertisements. Ours is like, we have this machine that does something. And sometimes the machine is not that different than other machines, or not different at all. And then, it's obviously on the company to try to like explain. So I feel like those things are all a little disconnected, and that's the challenge for me. So what I tried to do with this was I tried to organize like a radiation 101 sort of informational thing, where I think it can be broken down into kind of 4 parts. And the goal is to really give patients an understanding of how it works, but not like in the nerdy sense, because we can get like super nerdy with this if we want, but it's more like understanding how it works, but how that relates to how we design and deliver the fields, how the patients experience getting radiation therapy through the several days of treatment, and then how the side effects show up, and what the use of the modality is in cancer care, because it does have a lot of uses and it's kind of used differently in different settings. And so I think once we get that done, then maybe we can do 2 more, maybe shorter episodes, one on proton therapy, because I know it's a hot topic and we got a million questions about that. And then one on SBRT, or stereotactic body radiation therapy, which is a hot topic. And what's cool with that one is that, Katie, that in the renal cell carcinoma space, or in like the kidney cancer space, that's actually the type of radiation that's really showing to be pretty beneficial, and is kind of, like you said, it's something that was less talked about even 5 or 10 years ago, and now it's kind of much more emerging. And I think it would be nice to make people aware of it as a modality in that type of cancer.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to see that even just in resources. I actually remember when I was first diagnosed, Googling, trying to figure out what treatments there were for kidney cancer, thinking that like chemo and radiation were the two things that came to mind for me about cancer in general, because I didn't know really a whole lot about cancer. And I thought those were pretty much the only treatments. And I actually went on a complete spiral one night because I had Googled and gone down a Google rabbit hole and found out that chemo and radiation don't typically work for kidney cancer. And so I thought that meant there were no treatment options at all, which I think shows a couple of things. One, it's not good to go down Google rabbit holes and how dated some of the information can be, because I didn't find anything while I was searching at the time. I didn't find a whole lot talking about immunotherapy or other treatment options that are available. And I also think that like more targeted radiation is starting to be used in kidney cancer as well too. So I'm glad that we're going to talk about it on the podcast, because I think it'll be really good for patients to be able to hear kind of some of the advancements in that area. And then I hope eventually one day that trickles on to the rest of the internet as well too.
Yeah. No, and it was just to reassure you, I've had a conversation with a urologist. So like, as an expert in kidney cancer. And as recently as like 2 years ago, I had a conversation with one that also said to me, I thought radiation doesn't work for kidney cancer. So it's like an ingrained thing that's been true for a long time, but we'll talk about how it's kind of not anymore in certain settings. So for today, I kind of, let's try not to make this like me just lecturing at both of you. So feel free to chime in with questions or to say things. But what I try to do is organize like 4 overarching points to understand for like radiation 101, to kind of get the baseline to understand what we're talking about. And that way, when we have these future episodes, it'll make a lot more sense for people. And like I said before, that you can go down many rabbit holes here, and like there are whole fields of science that study like just one of these points that we'll talk about. And so we'll try to be pretty superficial with things. We can link to a bunch of stuff. I was trying to gather some links that I thought were pretty good, and we can put them in the show notes. And so you'll hear me mention like multiple times that we can just kind of move on from something. If you want to read more or hear more, you can go to the links that we offer. So maybe we should just start. I don't know if anything else to say before we jump into the lecture, I guess.
Let's get going.
The non-lecture. Yeah. So the 4 points that I had, like really for 101, is what is radiation and how does it kill cancer and cause side effects? So like, what does it do to the tissues? The second thing is, how is radiation used in medicine? Because something that gets overlooked a lot is the goals of what we're trying to do with radiation when we deliver it. The third point is how radiation plans are created and delivered. And that's kind of like what the patient experiences, what you go through the day-to-day, and how is radiation improved? Because there's a big story there. And that's really what I try to teach patients a lot in my clinics. And then who are the workers and what's the workflow? So like, what do you actually do when you get radiation? I think most people feel like when you go to surgery, you like go back to an OR and you get put to sleep and they cut something out. Radiation's like, if you polled a bunch of patients who were just diagnosed, like what do you actually do to get radiation? I don't know if people would really know. So for point 1, what is radiation and how does it kill cancer? I actually started way back at the beginning, because I think we should assume that a lot of patients maybe either never learned or have forgotten their basic science courses. Were you guys ever taught about electromagnetic energy, like that spectrum with light and radio waves? And
I may have, but I probably didn't pay any attention to it because I didn't think I would ever need to know that in my life.
I was about to say the exact same thing.
And you can get radiation without knowing about this, but I just want to like kind of set that up because it's important to understand what it actually is, right? So when we talk about radiation in the clinic or in medicine, what we're actually talking about is a part of what's called electromagnetic energy. Definitely screwed that up. Electromagnetic energy. If you look at like the figure that I will link to in the show notes, you might remember it where it's this like thing with waves of light, and there's a part of visible light where you have like red, yellow, green, blue, so on and so forth. And then if you go higher energy than that, you get into ultraviolet and then into like X-rays. And X-rays are essentially the basic stuff that we use to treat with radiation. It's not always true. And there's going to be like I said, you can totally go down a rabbit hole. And if people want to like write in and comment that we got stuff wrong about the physics of this, that's okay. The goal is to not teach radiation physics, is just to understand kind of what we're talking about. And so it's basically like very powerful light. And I do explain that to patients. It's radiation is like all around us at a low level at different types of radiation. And so this is something that we've just sort of harnessed in medicine to do things for us. And a lot of people may know or have heard or seen on TV kind of how this was created, but basically radiation in general, or X-rays, were discovered in the early 1900s. And right after that, people realized that when you expose people or tissues to X-rays, certain cancers will shrink or die. And that was kind of like the initial discovery that drove people to start using radiation as a treatment. And the important point that I'm trying to get to is that it was a very early cancer treatment. So it predated chemotherapy by many decades, and it was used in a lot of different patients in gynecologic cancers, things like that. And as our understanding of radiation improved, we started to like develop it more and more into a therapy. And so the important thing for most people is that in 1924, they created what was called a LINAC, or a linear accelerator. It's probably a term that you've heard in the past, and that's kind of what the radiation machine is for the most part, for most instances, and I'll talk about that in a second. But basically, this is a machine that patients can lay on, and it creates a beam of radiation therapy, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the goal of the whole treatment is to target that beam of radiation to the area of the tumor, or where the tumor used to be, to try to deliver the therapy. So that's the entire concept. So like this machine was developed in the 1920s, and the entire story of radiation therapy, for the most part, there's some exceptions, have been enhancements to this machine over the last 100 years to make the radiation better. And so for the vast majority of patients that get any kind of radiation therapy, they're going to be laying on a machine that we call a LINAC, or a version of it, and they're going to get that type of radiation. And just to put this in context, there are other types of radiation. So just for like informational purposes, you can take a pill that's radioactive that is often administered by radiation oncologists or other types of doctors. That's separate from this, and we won't really talk about that much more. There's something called brachytherapy, which instead of using a machine to generate a beam of radiation, you just take a piece of metal that happens to be very radioactive, and you place it in a procedure next to the tumor. So it delivers its radiation kind of out of that piece of metal. So those are different, like totally different things. They fall under the concept of radiation therapy, and we can talk about them in detail. But overall, I think that for most patients, they're going to be getting what we now call external beam radiation, which is delivered on that machine. And that's going to be like what most people are going to get, and what we'll most talk about. And when we talk about like proton therapy, that's delivered as a form of external beam radiation. Same thing with SBRT. That is a style of delivering external beam radiation. So like, I think we can sort of set aside the brachy and things like radioactive iodine and the stuff that we do in the hospital that patients may be aware about. That is part of radiation therapy. It's just sort of like separate, and it's relatively less common. So I think it's, for the purposes of this, we'll just kind of focus on external beam. I did want to mention really quick, there is a medical resident, so a trainee, a radiation oncologist trainee, that put out recently a very excellent podcast that goes over the very basics of radiation. So like, what are particles? What are photon beams? How are they used in medicine? I thought it was an excellent review, and it's actually intended for medical students, but I think it would be great for interested patients because it's not so high level. It's a really nice basic review that goes deeper into what is a photon, what is photon beam radiation, what is particle radiation, like electrons or protons or neutrons, and how are they used in medicine. So I can just, maybe this will be a point where we can just kind of like refer people to that, and they can sort of look at it.
I actually didn't know that radiation predated chemotherapy. I'll say that that's something that I did not know. Before
I
Yeah.
you
didn't know
mentioned
that
that,
either.
I would have assumed that it came much later for some reason.
Yeah, no, it was very early because it came right after the discovery of X-rays, which was like at the very late 1800s, like right at the turn of the century. And what limited development actually was like hardware. So I learned when I was researching this that the linear accelerator, which is like our most common tool, like when I go to work, that's what I use every day on all of my patients or most of them. Um, that was actually developed in the 20s. I did not know that. It's normally referenced as being developed in the 50s. This is like really niche and not important, but it was limited actually by the type of electricity that you could get out of the wall. And it wasn't until they had higher voltage electricity in the 50s that we had like modern linear accelerators. And that's why I think I was probably taught they weren't really around until the 50s, because the ones that they had in the 20s, 30s, and 40s were like we would not want to use those today for most cases. They're pretty toxic and they're not as useful as the ones that we have in 2023. So I actually never knew that either. So I learned something during the development of this.
I just have a question. We're probably going off on a tangent here, but what I'm curious about is, I mean, because obviously there's been developments, and I think we'll talk about this when we get into some of the other episodes of like really kind of high dose radiation that's very targeted. So it makes me wonder if like this predated chemotherapy, how did they know it worked? Like, because it couldn't have been that successful in people without really high toxicity, but maybe it was.
Yeah, well, so I think what you have to remember, and this is something that I want to actually like research more just as my own interest, is like the history of medicine. I think where we are today is very different than things were in the early 1900s. Like back then, people would get very sick from cancer and there was like nothing you could really do to fix it. Like there was surgery, and they could try things, but nothing really worked. And so the stakes were so high that like people were willing to just like stick people's hands under an x-ray machine and like see what happened, because the alternative was like you would die from the cancer. So clearly it's a gross simplification of how it probably really was, but it became a treatment out of need. And and a lot of it was like kind of trial and error. And so once they had like the machines that produced x-rays in medicine, and that predated radiation therapy, so that was like 1896, 1897, then pretty quickly they started to like notice that tumors would respond to the x-rays, and then you'd have doctors that would go off on a tangent like looking at ways they could use the x-rays to treat people. And it wasn't like rigid clinical trials. Like some of these old papers, the oldest paper that I have in my like personal database, I think is from the 40s. And they're essentially narratives. It's like a doctor who like is describing these 20 patients that he treated in this way. And he's like just writing out like what happened. And so it's not like a rigorous clinical trial. It's like literally like these guys just try it and that's, and so I think we've come a long way. And I think that it's very important for the rights of patients to like have rigid clinical trials. But this was a time where they learned a lot quickly because they just were trying things,
Very interesting.
So and to your point, so just so people can understand, like basically what this is an X-ray machine is, and again, people should go to Wikipedia and read about it if they're interested, but it's essentially passing electricity through a piece of metal that then by being hit with the electricity, it makes an X-ray that it emits. And they quickly learned you could see bones that way and see into bodies that way. And then they quickly learned you could treat with them. And so what a radiation machine is essentially is it just takes, in our case, in the modern era, it takes electrons, it accelerates them to the speed of the light. So that's where you have a linear accelerator. It basically accelerates them down a line, like a physical line that's made of metal. And then those electrons smash into a tungsten target, and then they create X-rays that come out of a head, kind of like a flashlight. So when I describe my patients like the radiation machine, like it basically is making a beam of radiation, of X-ray radiation, like a flashlight. And the entire goal of treatment is to take those beams and add them up and create what I described in these notes as a dose cloud. Sometimes we'll use the term field, but basically it's like a area of dose in someone's body that usually is around a tumor or an area where a tumor used to be. Does that like make sense about what it actually does? Or not really? You can say no.
No, it actually was helpful for me, just thinking back to my own experience. I don't know that, like I said, I was less concerned about that stuff. And so I don't remember all the details that we talked through, but, now I'm at a different place where I'm more interested in how things work. And so, that was really helpful for me.
And I think it's this because it's so complicated, right? Like I'm really, really underplaying how hard it is to do this well. So people have worked for decades to make this really good. And there's important achievements that were done that like make it really good for patients these days. But at the end of the day, it's just a machine that rotates around the patient and delivers beams of radiation from different angles, and they add up to make what I say a cloud, because I want people to understand that it's like a 3D thing, right? It's not like a square. It's not, a little plane. It's basically like a bubble of dose in the patient. And typically it's around a tumor, around an area that we're worried about that we need to treat. And so when we talk to patients about radiation, what I try to communicate to them is like what matters, because so many of these questions that we got were like, how much radiation can I get? How much is too much? What is it about these side effects? Why are some side effects different than others? It all has to do with how the field or the cloud of radiation interacts with the body and the tissues. And the things to know, in my opinion, are the size of, and this affects how people feel or the effects of the radiation on people. It's the size of the cloud, right? So a really big cloud, like if you're treating someone's entire lung, making a cloud around their entire lung of radiation versus just a very small spot of their lung, the big cloud is going to have a lot of side effects compared to the small cloud. If things are very small, you can give lots of dose and people don't have a lot in the way of side effects for the most part. The other thing is what's really important and people get confused about easily, even radiation doctors, is what I call dose fractionation, which is the dose given and the amount given per day. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's like, so if you give a really big dose over 2 days, or if you give a really little dose over 10 days, that latter situation where you're giving just a little bit per day over 10 days, that tends to be more well tolerated or have less side effects. And then the last one really is the total dose. So it's probably pretty easy for patients to understand that if you just get a little radiation, there's not a lot of side effects. If you get a lot of radiation total over all those days, there's more side effects. I did throw in here in these notes that there's speed, like if you give it really fast versus slower, that does affect it, but we leverage that a lot less, so it doesn't come up that much in clinic. And the effect there is a little bit less important than the other things I just talked about. So like I try to get patients to like remember that, every case really is genuinely unique because it is an interaction between the size of the field, how much you're giving and over how many days, and then the total dose you give. And because that varies so much from patient to patient, like one of the things I find myself saying all the time is like, whatever your mother had, like this is nothing like what your mother had. And here's the reasons why. And hopefully that makes sense, because that's very different than like milligrams of a drug, right? Like if you like people kind of understand that if you like give more drug, you get more side effects, that kind of a thing. Or it's like the size of a surgery. That's pretty straightforward. Radiation has this weird factor where like the speed matters and like size still matters, but not as much. And those kinds of things. So to me, it's a little more confusing than like the other modalities that we use in oncology. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, for me, that kind of makes sense when you explain it that way. I just don't think that it's described that way very often. Like, I think it's pretty easy to wrap your head around that. Like, if one drug existed 20 years ago and it wasn't very effective, but we've got a new drug that we're using now and it's more effective, like that kind of just makes sense. Like you think they're just different drugs, so it makes sense that it would work differently. And so I think that's the piece that's a little bit harder to tease out about radiation, but hearing you talk about it and talking about like the different targets and the dose and like hearing the factors that have changed over the years, those are the parts that make a little bit more sense of why it's different. But I don't know if I, as a patient, have ever heard, like I've heard of the different I guess that's not quite true. So like I've heard of like SBRT and some of the other types. Yeah, I'm not even going to mention them all because I know I'm inaccurate at knowing like proton and all of these things. Like I've heard all of these phrases, but I'll say as a patient, especially a patient that like radiation isn't used a ton in kidney cancer or historically wasn't used a ton in kidney cancer, like I don't know what those things are. And I don't know that those are like different types of radiation. I know now that there are different types of radiation and I've had a general idea, but I don't know that in the same way that I know two different drugs are different drugs, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, no, and it's you are right. And so you're totally right. The other thing that I should say is that if there's like a radiation biologist listening to this, they might be pulling their hair out because there are differences, right? So it's obviously much more complicated than I'm kind of making it. But one thing that's always been true is we have like clinical radiation oncology, which is like what we do in clinic. Like when I see patients and decide how I want to treat them and then treat them, that's like one thing. And it is related sometimes quite loosely to radiation biology, which is our understanding of when you change the dose per day or you change the type of radiation, like how is that going to affect the outcome of the treatment? We do not know very much in that space. Like we know a lot, but we don't know nearly enough as we need to be able to tell patients things that are meaningful to them in clinic. So like that's an area where there's still a lot of mystery there. It is true that actually if you take photon radiation or X-ray radiation, that's the same thing, by the way. It's just kind of like an analogous term. And then you use proton radiation. If you look at Twitter, you might see people arguing about what we call the relative biological effect. For all intents and purposes, we call them the same, but they're actually not. And in some tissues, they may be pretty different, and in other tissues, maybe they're the same. And so it's really complicated, like in real life. But this is where I feel like it falls apart sometimes trying to teach patients because they should know that if they want to, in my opinion. But that aspect of the mystery of radiation is not useful in clinic because we don't do anything with it. So like people can ignore it if it confuses them. Patients can, radiation biologists can't because it's their job. But that's where I feel like sometimes we get in a little trouble there. And some of the questions I saw that people ask like reflect that they've heard some of this and they kind of are misunderstanding the importance of it. And so like, that's why, like I saw someone asked a really good question that was, should I have SBRT or protons? If you ask that to a radiation oncologist, that's like asking, should I give someone cisplatin or chemotherapy or an apple? Like, it's not, it's not a choice that most people make in general. And you can give SBRT with protons actually. So like I feel like what's happening is people are picking up these terms or hearing partial explanations and then not really understanding the background. So that's kind of the goal here. I don't want to dwell too much on the biology of it, mostly because I don't understand it as well as I wish I did. And it kind of is a bothersome subject for me. But at the end of the day, like the dose and speed matters a lot. So like, Julie, we'll talk in Proton show about this, but we talked about how like in your case, we went from once a day to twice a day. We'll talk about that. But how we actually do that in real life is through a phone app. And so I put on my notes like this example of radiation dose and how we measure it. That was a question that somebody asked. We use this term called gray. That's kind of like milligrams. I'll use the example. It's sort of like milligrams of a drug, but it's unique in that the speed you give it actually affects its biological effects. So if you take 500 milligrams of Tylenol at once, and you take 1,000 milligrams of Tylenol at once, of course it will affect your body differently, but the relationship between how much radiation and how fast you give it is pretty opaque and confusing and not so straightforward the way it is for milligrams. And so an example I gave using my little phone calculator is two examples, 8 gray given in a single treatment or a single fraction of radiation. That equals about 30 gray of biologically equivalent dose that we use. We don't have to dive into the details of that, but that's like basically in our heads, that's like giving 30 gray. If we do 4 gray times 5 treatments, so instead of 8, we're giving 20, 4 times 5, that actually is like 46 gray. So I don't want to get in the numbers too much here, but you can see that 20 is more than double of 8 numerically. The biological effect is not more than double. Hopefully that makes sense. So there's a complicated equation we have to use to relate these together. And part of why I think patients get so confused about the term gray and the way we report out the dose of radiation is that it's not like straightforward 1-to-1. There's a complex equation that we use that really is now just these days converted to an app. And that's sort of how we use that in clinic.
So can I just ask a quick question on how do you talk about it with patients? Do you talk about it as 4 gray times 5 fractions, or do you talk about it as the total, as the 46 gray, or do you talk a lot about dose with patients?
So I don't. I mean, so I would say where it does come up is in patients that are pretty technical. What's much more common is sometimes you might have 2 different choices. And so like in sarcoma is a great example. There's the old way of treating, which is 25 treatments, Monday through Friday they're given. So it's 5 weeks of radiation. There are new studies that have used this equation to argue, you know what, let's give 5 treatments of radiation. And I'll tell them the gray. So it's 50 gray and 25 versus 30 gray and 5 or 35 gray. It's different versions, but 50 gray and 25 versus 30 gray and 5. And we only know that those are equivalent because they've been studied. And so in theory, they should be equivalent, but we've actually tried that in patients and they show similar results. They've never been compared head to head. And so I'll kind of talk with patients about the pros and cons of each strategy. And we try to find, at least I try to find the best, because they both give good outcomes, in my opinion. I try to find what fits best with those patients' values and then the other things that are happening in their life. So like really easy example is if someone's coming to my clinic from 4 hours away and they're very young and they work full time, you might not be surprised to hear that they prefer the 5 treatment because it's just shorter amount of time of their life, right? There are downsides to that we talk about, but that's kind of how I end up talking about it. It's very rare that I'll break out the app or the equation and kind of talk about it with patients in that sort of detail.
Yeah, I don't remember talking about the dose of radiation that I would be getting when I went through this. So if we do have patients, like, are there questions? If we do have patients that are listening that are thinking, starting radiation, or maybe that's a decision they have to make, like, are there questions they should be asking about dose? Like, are there dose questions that would be good for them to ask, and what are they?
I highlighted one in red that somebody asked that I really liked, which was, why aren't we using the lowest effective dose versus the highest tolerated dose?
That's so funny because I just wrote that question. I had forgotten that was on here, and as you're talking, I'm writing down questions. And my question is, why don't we use like a minimum effective dose versus the maximum tolerated dose?
Yeah, and so I love this because it's a great segue to like the next point, which is how is radiation used in medicine. So let's like kind of, I guess for people, we can just say we're moving on to the next point. And to answer that question, it really matters what we're trying to achieve, right? And so I put a link in here about how radiation became a treatment. It speaks a little bit to what Katie said about how a lot of patients are not familiar with how things went in the 20s and 30s in medicine. It was very different than it is today. It's from cancer.org. I thought it was a really nice description and pretty interesting. So I'll link it on the notes. But it matters what you're doing. And so there's a couple of different ways that radiation is used in oncology or in cancer care that are really important for people to know. This is not a comprehensive list, but let me just give that as a preface to that question. The first is curative. So that's like you just get radiation and that's it. And it cures the cancer, or the goal is to cure the cancer, I should say, is a better way to put it. A great example of this is like with prostate. So, men that are familiar with treatment of prostate cancer will know there's lots of choices. And one of those choices is radiation by itself. You just give a high dose of radiation to the prostate, and it's very effective. It's never been compared in the United States, but most people would agree that it's likely as effective as surgery, which is another very common treatment for prostate. The other place that's really important that I want people to know about is early stage non-small cell lung cancer. That was a surgical disease for a really long time. And like in the 90s, they came up with a special type of radiation, SBRT, to try to cure people who could not have surgery for early stage non-small cell lung cancer because they were too sick for surgery. And so that's like another place where, in my opinion, radiation really shines as a curative treatment. It offers really good cure rates to people. And it's a treatment that's available kind of all over the country. More and more, we learned in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s that radiation alone is probably not strong enough to kill cancer on its own. And so frequently when we're using it curatively, we use it with chemo. So like, head and neck cancers can be treated without a surgery at all. You just deliver radiation to the cancer, you give the patient chemo during the radiation, and it vanishes and goes away. And many people are cured that way. So that's like kind of something we see quite often. The other places we use it are along with surgery to reduce the risk of recurrence. So like Julie, in your case, sarcoma is a great example where if we do surgery by itself, we know that it comes back way too frequently. So the standard of care is to deliver radiation either before or after the surgery to sort of, sometimes they'll use the term clean up the mess or give an insurance policy. You might have, I don't know, Julie, if you like heard those terms from your treatment team, but we use those terms like a lot to talk about radiation with surgery. And I try to describe to patients, that's like, we're sort of sterilizing the area where the doctor is going to operate so that if there's any cancer cells left behind, that those are dead and they're not able to form a recurrence. And so that's a distinct way that we use it, separate from curative on its own, if that makes sense. The last one that's super important is palliative, or to make people feel better. And that's about half of the practice for most radiation oncologists. So it's pretty important. It's also, in my opinion, still not well known enough. Like I have patients that are referred to me that have lots of pain from a spot of cancer, and they've tried pain meds and things like that. It's not working. And we finally treat them and they do so much better. And so I think people getting in earlier to people, if they have like a symptom or a problem from their cancer, to consider if radiation can help fix it. Bleeding is like another one. So to go to that point, you have to ask, like, why aren't we using the lowest effective dose for the setting? And so in the curative setting, when you're using radiation by itself, you can imagine how a doctor has to be pretty brave. Actually, it's better to say a patient has to be pretty brave to go for a study or an experiment where we use a lower dose that may not cure them in a situation where we know we have a treatment that they can be cured. Does that sort of make sense? Like,
yeah, it does.
And there are studies like that, and we've gained ground that way. But it's kind of true for I've seen lots of patients on Twitter say this about chemo as well. It's like, why don't we start with a much lower dose? Well, the idea is like, if you have you're in a spot with a patient where that you can cure them, and you can cure them with a pretty high rate of cure. It takes a lot of bravery for both the doctor and the patient to like try doing less and see, because if it doesn't work and it comes back, then everyone's kind of sure you've left the patient worse off than if you use the known dose.
Are lower doses used more often when it's not in the curative setting?
Yes, that's a great question. So it goes a little bit back, diving deep down into the radiobiology thing. You can find literature and websites and stuff that talk about the mechanisms and how we got to that equation that I talked about that helps us convert doses and things. Radiation, unlike surgery or chemo, well, no, that's not fair to say. Radiation in general, I don't know if people view it, surgery and chemo, this way, is kind of a statistical thing where a lot of our models are arguing that the more dose you give, the higher chance the patient will be cured. Obviously, that's not true for everybody in real life. It's just a model, but that's the general thinking. And so if you're trying to cure a patient, which means kill all of the cancer cells, that takes a much higher dose. And so people that get treated for prostate cancer or lung cancer, head neck, they tend to have a numerically higher dose than people who, for example, are just having palliation of pain, because I don't need to kill as many cancer cells to make someone feel better as I would need to make them be cured, if that makes sense. It's a gross simplification, but hopefully that gives a little peek into how we think about it a little bit.
That's helpful, because I was just writing down a question that was, if you have a patient that has a tumor and he or she comes for palliative radiation, why aren't we just radiating to get rid of that tumor? I mean, wouldn't that also help the pain? And I mean, it may not be curative, but
yeah, you're right. And I think, yeah. And we're
one less
caught up
tumor in the body.
Unless what'd you say?
I just said, there would be one less tumor in the body.
Yeah. And so this is why I love this show and talking with both of you, because you're at the level where you're asking the questions that we're asking, right? I mean, the idea generally that we do know is that, like, remember, this is the three indications. There's the palliative, There's, with surgery to sort of clean up the risk. And then there's curative. That's like increasing dose. You don't need much dose to make people feel better. If the tumor itself is taken out by a surgeon, there's way less cancer cells to kill. So you can do a little, more dose, but not as much. And then if you have to kill it on your own, you have to do the most dose. And so people always say, well, okay, well, why can't we just, treat this tumor with a really high dose and make it go away? We've tried that in some settings. The problem is like, for example, if a patient has what we call metastasis, which means that the tumor has left where it started and gone elsewhere in the body, we can kill that original tumor and make it go away, but there's still those cells floating around that are going to pop up and cause problems in the future. So there's quite a leap you have to make from this theory of what it does to actually helping the person in real life for the things that they care about. And to me, there's a huge gap there that we have not closed. And that's where that's the subject of a lot of our studies. And so, like in kidney cancer, for example, we went from a place where historically we couldn't safely give enough dose to try to help with it. Now we can, and we're finding new ways that we can use it to actually have meaningful outcomes for patients. That's probably the best I can answer the question, because it's one of these questions where we are actively studying and arguing about it right now in the field. Did I lose you, Bill? Are you on?
No, I'm thinking. That's why I'm silent.
Fell asleep. Nobody fell asleep.
No.
Yeah. So I think two quick things to kind of wrap up how it's used is that, so what's actually happening? Patients a very common question is like, what happens to the tumor? Like when you take it out with a knife, you take it out, it goes in a bucket, you look at it under the microscope, so on and so forth. When you give chemo, it's a medicine that kills the cancer. Well, what does radiation actually do? When you shoot the radiation into the tissue, it creates oxidants. This is like a fun thing for me to tell patients, because everyone knows about antioxidants and why they're supposed to be good for you. It creates lots of oxidants inside the cells, and then those oxidants damage the DNA so that when the cancer cells try to divide, they die. And there's kind of three important things there. One is that it's actually kind of an indirect effect, and the oxidants are created kind of in the tumor and around it, and the tissues that don't have cancer sometimes get sort of bystander effects and get harmed that way. The other thing is that they don't die until they try to divide. So the rate that a cancer or a tumor will shrink away or go away with radiation will actually vary by the behavior of the tumor. If it grows really fast, it usually means it's dividing a lot. And so if it's dividing a lot, it will die really fast. Some cancers, like my favorite example of this is prostate. You could treat a prostate cancer with a full dose of radiation, and it could be 18 months or 2 years before we see the PSA go down to a low level, reflecting that all the cancer has been killed. And that's just because it's such a slow dividing cancer that the damage has been done, but it doesn't manifest itself until you get to that, until like they start to try to divide. And so that, again, huge leap between that biology concept to what we actually see and react to in clinic, because in there is like how we test for the cancer responding and the different ways we look at that. And there's all this variation there. But at the end of the day, the important point for patients to know is like, you shoot the beam of radiation, it creates a bunch of oxidants and damage inside the cell, and then the cells try to divide, and they either they basically die ultimately, and your body kind of resorbs them. And so that's why that's kind of how the tumor will react to radiation after we give it.
And
so, I'm sorry, go ahead, Julie.
I was just going to say, and I guess that's why radiation oncologists tell patients not to take antioxidants during radiation, because it offsets the oxidative stress of the treatment.
Yes, in theory. And I actually emphasize that. So the idea is like the oxidants are created over a very, very short, I mean, we're talking like, way less than a second, like it's a very fast process. And so I do tell patients, like when you're on treatment, getting radiation, like, you know, if you're going to come in for radiation on a Wednesday, like don't take a high dose of an antioxidant that day. But it's totally theory. There's never been a study that shows it's bad. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever going to run that study. And so I've had a rare patient, very rare, one or two of them in my whole career, where they've been adamant that they want to take the antioxidants. And I say, look, you know, it's your treatment. This is a theoretical thing. So you should, you know, I'm advising against it, but you should do what you feel is best. And so we do generally recommend that's like kind of one thing that we tell people they really shouldn't take during radiation. And it's based on that theory right there. Yeah.
Fascinating. I didn't even know that was the thing.
The separate thing, so that's what it does to the cancer. The same effect happens. It's not that sophisticated of a tool. It's like we shoot a beam and it makes oxidants. That's how it causes side effects as well. And along the lines of the cancer relating to its behavior, the side effects are related to the behavior of the tissue that gets radiated. And so skin is a really good example because most patients are familiar with the sunburn from radiation, and it's not a temperature burn. So the burn that people get is not like if you put your hand on a hot stove. What it actually is we are we're creating oxidants and they're damaging cells. And some cells healthy cells can repair themselves. But what happens is the cells in your skin are actually replaced all the time by your body, just naturally. They're shed off and they make new skin, and it kind of gets replaced all the time. And radiation damages the cells that are replacing the skin. And so when you start getting treatment, when you hit a certain dose, what happens is you start to have skin being inadequately replaced, and it can sort of end up getting irritated. And then in the shape of the radiation field as it enters the skin on your body, that's why some patients might see, you know, a skin reaction that resembles a sunburn. It's much closer to an actual sunburn, which is caused by UV light. So it's just a different type of radiation as UV light than it is to a temperature burn, if that makes sense. And so, but those side effects are related to those tissues, and generally we'll have tissues that we feel like get some effects that come quickly and they heal. So skin is a great example. I'll tell patients you'll get the sunburn-like effect. It'll turn into a tan, and then down the line, it will heal for the most part. Caveat, that doesn't always happen, but it does for most. There's some tissues that don't heal very well from radiation. So one of them you'll hear people talk about a lot is the brain or spinal cord. And so we're very careful with doses there. And we tend to dose our plans to minimize the risk of those side effects because they can be very catastrophic and they happen down the road and they're sort of hard to reverse. And so to importantly just kind of link everything, the dose and fractionation is like a very fundamental concept in this field that's been around for many decades. And we use those models to think about, number one, how can I deliver this radiation to be effective in killing the cancer? So we call that, like a probability of cure, right? Can we model that? What does a dose and fractionation lead to a cure? The other half of it is what dose and fractionation leads to a probability of a side effect in a tissue nearby. So if you're radiating a lung tumor, then you have to think about not only killing the tumor, but what's the chance of harming the lung, the heart, the spinal cord, the ribs, the nerves in the chest, that kind of thing. So that's, at the end of the day, when we're picking dose and fractionation to create like paradigms for how we treat people, that's where it comes from. And then once they're established through like a clinical trial, it becomes a standard, and that's how we treat. That's like the longest winded answer to why aren't we using the lowest or highest effective dose? But that's how we get to the doses that we use. And a major focus of this field over the last 30 or 40 years leading up to the early 2000s, 2010, was what we call dose escalation. So trying to use more dose safely to give better outcomes to patients. And that it has been achieved. It's a really important concept in prostate cancer and in lung cancer, where giving more dose safely has allowed us to cure more people with less side effects than 20 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I do think one thing that we haven't talked about a lot is, side effects for radiation. Like even just looking on the outline I see here that radiation can also be treated or used to treat benign conditions.
Oh yeah.
And we don't need to get a lot into that, but I don't know. I think it's interesting. Like, is there what are the risks of using radiation in general? I just hear a lot of patients talk about, the amount of radiation they're receiving and how detrimental that is to their bodies over the long term.
Yeah. So, and this is good. This is probably good to kind of close out the first part of the 101. I think so. This is where like you have to take a little bit of a leap. There's a lot of points in radiation where like we can talk about the background and the theory, and then you have to like kind of ignore the fact that there's no direct link to like what we tell patients in clinic, because a lot of that is learned from like many years of treating people with radiation and documenting the effects. And so everything has to do with the behavior of the tissues and the way that they heal and respond to radiation. But when we talk about side effects, there's kind of a couple of things that are important to know. One is that the radiation is very much like a surgery, and that the side effects tend to be limited to where we're delivering the radiation. So I'll often give a very like simple example to patients where if we treat their prostate, it's not going to really affect their brain. Now that's limited in our understanding a little bit, but for the most part, the effects are limited to the pelvis or the area where the prostate is. And so that's the first thing to know. The second thing to know is we break all of our side effects kind of into two groups. First is when they're getting radiation. We call those acute effects. So that's textbook by definition. That tends to be during radiation or shortly after, up to about 90 days. Like in studies, we'll usually cut off at 90 days. And that's what we talk about acute effects. And the most well-known, widely known one is the sunburn, right? That happens during radiation or shortly after, and it tends to come and go within a couple of months. And usually by about 90 days, it's gone, and you're kind of into you're healed from the acute effects of the radiation with the skin. The second group is the long-term effects that kind of comes after 90 days. And just like with any biology, it's not like a direct cutoff. It's just something we use to talk to patients about it. And those tend to be a lot less common, more serious, or irreversible, or both. And as such, we dose our radiation plans to minimize the risk of that happening. So, for example, in the skin, if you give radiation at a very low dose, nothing happens. If you give it at a medium dose, and we're starting to approach the doses that we use to kill cancer, you get pretty red. You might have some peeling, might hurt for a few weeks, and then it gets better. It might form a tan. And then that'll eventually heal to the point where people can look at it and it might look the same, but when you feel it, it might be a little bit thicker. You might have, Julie, you pointed this out, the sweat gland, you might have sweat glands in the skin that like don't work anymore. And that's because like we treated the skin, as a bystander, it healed. And then in its process of healing, like the sweat glands either become scarred and don't work anymore, or functionally they don't work for some other reason. And so that would kind of be considered a late effect. That we do know that if you keep going higher and higher dose, you'll get to a point where the skin just won't heal. It doesn't come back, and you then get like what's called an ulcer or a wound. And like we try our hardest to avoid giving that much dose to the skin, because a wound or an ulcer is a really bad side effect that can last a long time or be permanent and cause problems for people. And so we're always thinking about like how much dose can we give to minimize side effects, to make sure that the chance of a benefit outweighs the risks of those side effects. And so it's very tissue dependent. So like patients will very frequently ask, like, how much can I get? Can I get more radiation? Well, the rest of your skin outside the field has never seen any radiation. So it's basically like you're starting over fresh again. And that's why I always tell patients that how much you can get depends on what we're using it for and how much has been given in the past. And it depends on the tissue, because we know some can take more and some can take less. And so hopefully that starts to answer it a little bit. That seems like it was not a great answer to your question, but that's the way that we sort of think about it.
Yeah, that's helpful. I just feel like a lot of times we talk a lot about the skin.
Yeah.
because that's what you can see.
Yep.
But the radiation is also impacting things beyond the skin. And so I've always wondered, like, me receiving radiation, I still have visible signs that I received radiation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see that on my skin, but I always wonder, like, what inside my body, like, what are the implications from that radiation? Does that make sense? I don't know if my question even makes sense, but we do talk so much about the skin versus, like, well, there's a lot of other body parts that are impacted by the radiation as well.
Yeah. And the answer really is we don't always know, right?
Okay.
So like for you, there's skin, I guess we should just tell people you had radiation to your chest wall, right? Like, so
Yeah.
underneath where the breast tissue is, there's skin, there's ribs, there's muscle, there's lung, right? So like those are all right there. And that's what sort of is exposed to the radiation. And the reality is like, just to give a really easy example, the skin you can see, you said it yourself. So that's easy to talk about.
Yeah.
The ribs, like people's ribs are either fine or they're not fine. Right? It's like either it's like okay and it's a rib and it's doing what it's doing, or it's broken, right? And if it never breaks, it could have had some changes, but we will never know because we don't test for that or have a way to really see. Likewise with the muscle, like, a lot of breast radiation oncologists will talk to patients about the importance of stretching and range of motion exercises because the muscle can get irritated and can get like microscopically scarred from radiation in the long term. And generally, like doing those exercises will help prevent that from happening. The last piece that I'll say, and the reason I brought up the lung is this probably, that maybe this is a good topic for like one of these little video things we were talking about. But the other concept that's really important for side effects is that so skin, like you have, like if you draw a square and you draw radiation in that square, you drop radiation in that square, the skin cells from outside the square can come in and like replace the skin, right? Because you have like extra, the term we use for that in medicine is called a parallel organ. It means there's like extra functional units that can come in and like help replace what was damaged. The lung is the same way. A lot of patients know you can actually take out a big chunk of somebody's lung and their breathing will still be normal as long as the rest of the lungs are healthy. And so it is possible that if you took a microscope to the front of your lung, there might be some changes that we could see that reflect the radiation that was given even, what did we say, 4 years ago now?
And I mean, even when I have scans, the radiologist will comment on seeing that in the images.
Right. So like that's there and we see it in the images, but you might have heard me say that like it's not actually something to worry about because at the end of the day, what do you care about? You care about your breathing, not your lung and how it looks, right? So as long as your breathing is allowing you to do everything that you want to do, then in general, we wouldn't consider that to be a significant or impactful side effect. The fact that you can like see some change on the radiology. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I've just always wondered because like even my area where I received radiation, like it feels very different. Like it literally feels like a brick. And so I've always wondered what is happening inside my body. Did everything just kind of like fuse together? And is there limited blood flow and, things like that?
Yep. Yeah. And there are radiation biologists and experts out there. Maybe one day we'll have one of them on the show, but they study the changes to tissue over time. And really what it is it's like, remember, like radiation is just there for the time that we treat it. It creates the oxidants do their damage. And then that all happens like in milliseconds. Right. And then like everything else is like the body's reaction to it. And so there's a complicated flow of biology that goes from, the sunburn to healing. And then there's microscopic scarring is what I tell patients. Is very grossly simplified, but that's kind of like why it feels like a brick, for example. The term we use for that is fibrosis. One of the patients asked about fibrosis, and we will talk about that when we talk about SBRT. But there's lots of science around that. And I would tell you that like it's not front of mind enough for clinical doctors to be talking about it frequently. And I would say that we don't understand it all that well. Like we don't understand the specifics of what's happening as well as we need to be able to answer the question to the level that you're curious about, right? All we can tell you is, look, it's common for tissues to feel very hard after radiation down, years down the line, because of the changes that happen from the radiation. And what we do in response is we say, okay, I'm going to send you to physical therapy, because we know that if we get patients in with physical therapy, that it sort of minimizes the impact of that tissue hardness, to where, sure, like you might feel your tissue being hard, and that's definitely not like a pleasant thing for people. But what we really want is to make sure that you can move around your shoulder, you can twist, you can move around, you can drive, you can like do all the things that you want to do throughout the day. And if you have a good functional outcome, especially in sarcoma, it's a huge focus. If you have a good functional outcome, then we sort of say, okay, we've made this tumor go away and it's in remission, and we're happy with that. You have some side effects, but they're well managed, or you've adjusted your life to work around them and you're happy. And so therefore that's a good outcome. And that's kind of like, that's the leap between the biology or the mechanism of what's happening to the best we can do in clinic for our patients, given the things we don't know.
Okay. That's helpful.
And by the way, I'm not like putting words in your mouth. I don't know your own feelings yet about how your things went and the outcomes there, but that's like what we strive for. And we have to take a mental leap, because I can't say like, oh, this patient has this type of tissue and therefore they have a higher risk of feeling like, feeling hard tissue at the end or whatever. It's very, we just don't know enough to be able to like act on it.
Sure.
Yeah. So I guess we'll have to keep going with the 101. So what I saw a lot of people asked about was, how is radiation planned and delivered? Somebody actually asked it in like a really funny way, and I loved it. It was like, what's taking so long during planning? Because it does take a long time. And yes. I sense the frustration there. So I like that question a lot. And then the last, so that was the third point, was how are they created and delivered, and how is radiation improved? That's an important story in my opinion. And then the last one is the workers and the workflow. So like, this would be like, the final thing I would usually tell patients is like, what's actually going to happen now? Like, when are you going to come in? That kind of thing. So those will be our 2 topics for the next show. And then we'll move on to our SBRT project.
I think that sounds good.